on the side here, I've got mobile applications, web applications. So I've got one project or one application, and it contains a lot of things, right? It contains a lot of service connections, it can contain business objects, right? I don't have any business objects in this, right? And it can contain multiple web apps and multiple mobile applications. Then you just deploy that whole thing at once, right? And all of your mobile and web applications can access your shared things like service connections and business objects, okay? So, service connections, so first of all, I've already, right, registered this service connection. I've got this on a mobile, Oracle Mobile Cloud service. I've got some REST APIs here. So, you know, and I'm already using the ones to get customers, right? I'm using the ones to get the details for a particular customer, right? I could potentially add another endpoint here, right? Say customers ID invoices, right? Or something like that, right? And then I could register this up. And the interesting thing about this is when I register this an endpoint, what I've done is I've said like, okay, where is the service, right? What authentication method am I going to use to access those services, right? Here I don't have any authentication on this service, so I just have direct, but you know, I could use any of the other ones, right? And then what are the endpoints? And the important thing about the endpoints is I've defined the request, right? So I've got some static headers that I need to pass in, and URL parameters, right? And then I've also defined the response. So I know what the JSON payload that's going to come back from these REST APIs looks like, right? That way I can handle that in my application, right? So I've registered these REST APIs.
Question quicker.
Yeah.
So if you have like optional fields, do you then do like multiple calls? How do you know, like say if my REST response has like a certain example will give me certain fields, but another will fill some more?
Right,
Can you make a difference within that, or should you then
in the response payload, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Basically, what you do is you just put in the full response payload of everything that
is possible.
That it is possible. The content and experience APIs are like the bulk operations API is a good example of that, right? Like it's got, you know, you pass in the body, and depending on what you pass in the body, your response is going to look different. And so in order to work with that, right, what I do is I just, in the response type, I paste in like all of the possible responses that it could return. And then when I go and I actually create variables of that type, I only select the response type, the parts of the response that are going to be necessary for that thing, right? So in my applications, I have flows and then I have pages. So flows are just a level of scope that is something larger than a page, but smaller than the entire application, right? So if you want to, you can define things like variables and types and action chains and so forth that are at each of these scopes, right? So I can define a variable that's only available on a page. I can define a variable like my, app username that's available to the entire application. But sometimes I want to have a scope that's in between those two, right? And so that's why I organize pages into flows, right? So that's what flows are. And so here I've got one main flow, and then I got a couple of pages inside that main flow. I'm going to close this to get a little bit of room here, right? And we can see that I've got variables, and one of my variables is a service data provider, and that's what is showing the list. So data providers are an important concept, so I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on them right now. So you saw data providers are yesterday in the labs, right? Data providers are basically arrays that have a lot of good stuff built into them, right? They've got pagination built into them, they've got sorting built into them. Their array data providers are how the selection components in Jet, like table and list and OJ select and so forth, do all the magic that they do. That's why we use those instead of using just regular arrays, right? Now, there's an additional data provider that is specific to Visual Builder, which is called the service data provider. Service data provider is cool because what the service data provider says is, I'm a data provider and I get my information from a REST API call, right? And so you'll see that I've registered the endpoint is my get customers API, right? And so what that means is that whenever the component that's bound to that data provider gets rendered, that data provider is gonna, on its own, it's gonna go out, call the REST API, get the response payload, and map that payload to its internal data structure, right? And how does it know what that structure looks like, right? Well, it knows what that structure looks like because it's created a type, right? See this response type? It's created a type, right? And there it is. And you'll see that this type here, the structure of this response type, matches exactly the payload that is returned by this REST API call. Right? So that's why we register, when we register REST APIs, we put in what does the request body look like and what does the response body look like. Because then we can create these client-side variables that match that structure exactly, and then it's super easy to just bind these back and forth, right? I don't need to do any kind of like complex filtering and mapping to get my response type to match. Sometimes I do, but most of the times I don't. Okay, so I've got my got very little room to work with here. All right, so I've got my I've got my list view, right? My OJ list view. It is bound to this SDP, right? And you can see under the events, it's also set to single selection mode, right? So I can select any one of these. And under the events, I can see that I've registered an event, right, that opens this action chain, right, which is navigate to customer, right? And so action chains, this is how we define behavior inside of Visual Builder, right? I can drag and drop any of these pre-packaged actions over to here and then work with them, right? So this is not a very interesting one. I've just got a navigate thing. I say, what's the target that I want to navigate to, right? But the one interesting thing here is I'm navigating to this other page, which is called my, here. And we can actually navigate to this page by switching into live mode and clicking it, right? So I'm navigating to this other page, and the interesting thing about this page is that it's got a variable that's called get customer ID. It was auto-generated, that's why it's got that funny name. But it's marked as an input parameter, and it's required, and it's passed on URL. That means anytime I navigate to this page, I have to provide the ID of the customer that I'm looking up in this page, right? It's a mandatory input parameter. So you'll see when I navigate to this page, it asks me what's the target, right? And I can pick from those, and then it says, hey, I've got a mandatory input parameter here of get customer ID, and I map it from, right, I map it from the action chain, from the selection event. I map that in. Right. And so this page is a little bit more interesting. If we look at the variables, I also have this get customer ID record, right, which holds all the information that I'm showing in this page. And again, where did I get the structure of this? Well, I got it from this endpoint here, which is the endpoint to fetch a single customer, right? Look at the response, there's the payload, right? So I've got all this information here, and how am I populating it? Well, if I look at my events, I've got a VB enter event. So when I enter the page, this action chain is going to get launched, right? And what does this action chain do? First thing it does is it calls the REST endpoint. So there's the endpoint. And this endpoint has a mandatory input parameter, right? And what are we going to use for that? We're going to use our page variable that we passed in. Remember, we passed in the ID of the customer we wanted to fetch. So that calls that rest, and then it waits for that to return. When it returns, it's going to either return with success or failure. If it returns with a failure, it's just going to give you a ooh, you know. And if it returns with success, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to map the body of that response to my local page variable, right? Which is and as you can see, the payloads match exactly, the structures match exactly, right? So I enter the page, I get passed in the ID, right? I have a VB enter event that launches this action chain. That action chain calls the REST API, passing in the ID of the customer I want to get. When that JSON, that REST call returns a body, right? And then I do assign variables to map the response body to my local variable, right? And then that data gets displayed in the page. And that's a basic kind of walk around a Visual Builder app, right? So what we're going to do is learn how to do all this stuff. So let's, all right. Okay, so for those of you who have not done the, okay, so for those of you who came late, you should have an email from me for registration to a Visual Builder instance, right? Go ahead and update your